I'm giving 2 lectures this morning devoted to the topic connected speech phenomena of connected speech. And the handouts, in fact, consist of photocopied bits out of the dictionary. But I thought that was perhaps the easiest way to do it, because I want to talk about a number of processes which are, in some sense, optional. Speakers don't always follow them when they speak, although they often do. They're optional processes, but they're quite important processes, particularly from the receptive point of view, that you should not cause difficulty in understanding when people modify their pronunciation in these ways. And many of them will be helpful also from the productive point of view, in as much as they indicate ways in which you can make the pronunciation in connected speech rather easier than it otherwise would be. I'm slightly embarrassed about calling them connected speech phenomena because, to be honest, all of them can also occur within individual words quoted in isolation, if only in the case of compound words, because the phonetics of compound words is really very similar to the phonetics of words strung together in a sentence. Well, as you can see on the front of the handout, I've listed the 7 types of process that I shall be talking about. They are respectively assimilation, elision, R-Liaison, weakening, stress shift, various allophonic effects, and compression. And the first of these then, on the front side of the handout, is assimilation. Assimilation is a process of making speech sounds more similar to one another. It's a natural human tendency, therefore. Whenever we articulate, we are pulled in 2 directions. We're pulled towards making our articulatory movements simpler, reducing the number of separate movements we have to make with our organs of speech. But we're also pulled in the direction of keeping our messages distinct, because if we allowed everything to be made simpler to the maximum, nothing would be distinct from anything else. Everything would become one great So I think the phonetics of all languages exhibit this tension between simplifying things on the one hand and nevertheless preserving distinctiveness on the other. So we're talking about natural human phenomena, and they may seem like very common sense things, but what is important is to remember that languages differ in the processes which they use and in the way in which they implement these processes. So we look first of all at assimilation, and the first type we can consider is something that is very widespread in different languages around the world. Some of you recently went with Sarah one evening, and you went ten-pin bowling. Now the first word here, you know that that's the number 10. And you know that 10 ends in an N, an alveolar nasal. Nevertheless, I'm sure Sarah pronounced it, usually, like I usually do, as ten-pin bowling. 10, pronouncing not an N, but an M at the end of that, as it were, ten-pin bowling. Now we know it isn't a matter of 10, there's no word 10 in English. We know that this is still 10, but it has this possibility of becoming assimilated in connected speech or within a compound, as is the case here. Right. What does this example tell us? Well, first of all, the problem that the speakers of Spanish have in English. Now, we know that speakers of Spanish have big problems distinguishing properly between syllable final M, N, and Eng in English. So we make you practice sets of words like rum, run, run, or wind, wing. And we drill you on these. we make you get them right. Quite correctly, because in isolation, or before a following vowel, we distinguish them. Nevertheless, this middle group, the group that basically end in N, can be pronounced with other nasals, providing that this is in order to facilitate the transition to the following consonant, that it follows this principle of assimilation. What happens then is that a final N sound, alveolar nasal, tends to assimilate to the place of articulation of a following consonant. If the following consonant, therefore, is made with the lips bilabial, that's one of P or B or M, we tend to pronounce 10 as 10, as in the case of 10 pin, or if I talk of 10 boys or 10 men coming into the room. This is going to apply to any word ending in an N, but only when it's in that particular environment. So if I say, it's a fine day today, fine, fine. Now when I said fine day, day begins with a D, which is also alveolar like N, so no assimilation is going to happen there. But supposing instead of saying it's a fine day, I wanted to refer to the morning. Then what would happen? Then what might readily happen is I'd change it from fine to fine. A fine morning. A fine morning. So what I say to the Spaniards is with final N, they can do this, which I'm sure will come naturally, because it doesn't matter, native speakers do it, it causes no problems. Similarly for the Japanese. Japanese nasal, the so-called moraine nasal, or syllabic nasal of Japanese, readily adopts the place of articulation of a following consonant. So when I learn to wish people their health in Japanese, I learn kanpai, and it's not kan or kan, but kanpai because of the p that follows. All right, so this is a very universal process. I'm not sure whether French people would do it so readily. I think perhaps in French there's a certain resistance to change of place of articulation like this. The French have other kinds of assimilation. When the following consonant is a velar, that's one of k or g, not a velar nasal because words don't begin with a velar nasal in English, then the assimilation is not to tem, but to tang, the velar nasal. So if we've got not 10 boys, but 10 girls, you can see what happens. 10 before the girl. 10 kinds of thing, 10 girls. That's sort of so simple that I don't know how to say anything more about it. Experience shows though that some people get into a muddle about it, so perhaps it is, if you find it a bit confusing, it's worthwhile going through it separately on your own carefully and seeing what's involved. Notice how this is more readily understood if we are masters of the classification of speech sounds in terms of voicing, place and manner. If you know immediately that b is a voiced bilabial plosive, voiced bilabial plosive, that's voicing, place and manner, the three things you have to say about a sound, then when I tell you that it assimilates according to place, you will understand this. The N, voiced alveolar nasal, changes its place, alveolar, to the place of the following consonant voice. Voiced bilabial plosive, it changes to bilabial. 10 boys becomes 10 boys. Now, that's easy with N. Exactly the same thing really happens with final D. When we have a word ending in D, what should we take? Let's take good. A word ending in good. We greet one another. Good plus morning. Well, we can say good morning with an ordinary D. But what we very often do is good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. We don't bother to move our tongue tips at all at that point. We simplify the articulation by making this final voice plosive, not alveolar, but bilabial, like the bilabial that follows. So again, it's place of articulation that's assimilated. Good morning, good morning. You don't have to do it, but equally you don't start asking what's this word go. If I see a bus that is red, it's a red bus. If we've got any bilabial here, P, B, or N, same thing happens, it's those same three. So good people, good boys, good morning. If the following word begins with a velar, double G, then the change is to a velar. So a good kind of something, a good girl. You notice that it's the final alveolars that are affected in this way. It's not other places of articulation. If we got big, followed by boy, for example, you might suspect that we would change this one to B and say big boy. It doesn't happen. We don't do it with final velars. We only do it with final alveolars. Very advanced students may ask me about certain bilabials that sometimes join in, but basically it's only alveolars. So good morning. What about final T? Many phonetics books will tell you that T does just the same as D and N, and that is sort of true, but not altogether. Supposing we've got 8 plus people, voiceless alveolar plosive, voiceless bilabial plosive, you would predict that this is going to become P, thus 8 people. Well, that is possible. But it's being overwhelmed by another phenomenon that is taking place in English now increasingly, and that is that we pronounce T at the end of a syllable before a consonant, not with the tongue tip, but at the glottis as a glottal stop. Thus we say 8 people, 8 people, 8 people. And because that is now the predominant pronunciation, this sort of removes the business of bilabial assimilation of T. It's not impossible, but it's not so perhaps important as it was. Now, we have looked at examples. We've looked at examples of final N, final D, and final T, alveolars. We've got some more alveolar sounds in English. In particular, we've got the alveolar fricatives, S and Z. Do they join in this assimilation? Well, they do, but only up to a point. Suppose we take the word this. Can we get that S assimilated? What if we got this plus man? What might happen there? Well, if it changed its place of articulation, I suppose you get something like the man. Well, doesn't happen. Similarly, if you got this plus girl, you might predict the girl. Doesn't happen. All right, so it's something somewhat different with fricatives. What does happen with fricatives is much more restricted. It's just before a following sh. If you've got shop, for example, this shop, we readily assimilate the place and say this shop. The whole thing becomes palatal alveolar. This shop is a fish shop. And similarly in the plural, these, Z, these plus shops can become these shops, these shops, these shops. Now, that brings us on to another point. When we've got this plus man, I was giving you the impossible version, some of you were sort of trying it out, and you were thinking what would happen in your language. Well, those of you who are Spanish speakers, think what happens in a word like mismo. Depends on what kind of Spanish you speak, but some of you would say things like mismo. And of course, this man is out as far as English is concerned. That kind of change would not be possible at all in English. Some of you speaking other languages might have come up with this man. This man. What am I doing in the case of this man? Voicing it, right. Many languages have voicing assimilation, where voiceless sounds become voiced before voiced consonants. With differences of detail, this applies, for example, in Dutch, in Greek, in Polish, in a number of different languages. Well, not in English. At least only in very, very tightly constrained circumstances in English. Certainly not in phrases like this plus man. We don't say this man, we say this man, with no change. And I think it's therefore important, when you're looking at this kind of phenomenon, these processes, not only to study what happens in English, but also to be aware of what happens in your own language, or your pupil's own first language, because it's necessary not only to learn what happens in English, but to unlearn what happens in your own language. Some people do the S to sh assimilation before yon, before the y sound. If we got a word like unit, for example, and they want to say this plus unit, some people will change that to this unit. Perhaps the commonest phrase in which it happens is this year, or this year. Not everybody does that one. What is quite striking is something that can happen with you and your. You can get this assimilating and indeed losing the yod entirely. So for unless you do it tomorrow, we can get, unless you do it tomorrow, where the S and the y really come out as a single sh. Again, that may seem very natural and ordinary to many of you, but not all speakers of English do that. Some do, some don't. Now, all of these assimilations we've been looking at so far can be classified as being anticipatory. This is the ones in 2 and 3 on the handout. They're anticipatory because we anticipate a place of articulation that's going to come. Sometimes referred to in the literature as reflexive assimilation, because the place of articulation features these factors. We have another more restricted kind of assimilation in English that operates in the other direction and is therefore called perseverative, progressive assimilation. And that's 4 on the handout. I have been catching myself doing this while I'm talking to you in the case of the word happen. That is happen. Can you hear how, can you see how I've been saying it happened, happens, where instead of pronouncing a sequence, happen, I'm saying happen. Now, this is something that I like to analyze in terms of a succession of processes operating. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but the first process is a syllabic consonant formation process, which means that we take a sequence, schwa, n, happen, and we convert it into a syllabic n, happen. This is a very familiar rule. It applies in words like station becoming station, 7 becoming 7, and so on. They're equivalents. You can do whichever you prefer. Well, we can say happen. And this is a necessary input for the rule of perseverative assimilation, because this applies only to syllabic nasals, only to syllabic n. And what it does is it changes the nasal place of articulation to agree with the consonant that precedes it. So for happen, we get happen. Ribbon becomes ribbon. It can also become velar, as in the example on the handout, where bacon gives you bacon, gives you bacon, and the whole thing is velar bacon. This operates in connected speech very strikingly with the word and. example on the handout gives you the phrase up and down, very readily in connected speech pronounced up and down. Up and down. Now what we have to analyze here is a succession of processes. Well, let's start with the weak form n. Up and down. That's a possible way to say it, up and down, up and down, up and down. Syllabic consonant changes that to syllabic n, up and down, up and down, up and down. Perseverative assimilation changes this to an n because of the p before it, up and down, up and down, up and down. Exactly the same with a phrase like back and forth. Back and forth. Syllabic consonant gives you back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Perseverative assimilation gives you back and forth. Then wieder, back and forth, back and forth. Again, I imagine this passes quite unnoticed in the stream of speech, but it's the kind of thing that automatic speech recognizers have to be taught about, otherwise they absolutely fail to identify a segment with the word and. But you can see how it's just a succession of these processes that gives it. The last kind of assimilation, 5 on the handout, coalescence. This applies to cases where we get words ending in T or D, particularly where they're followed by a yod in the word you, pronoun you. So, example on the handout, will they let you out? Let you out, let you out. We often say, will they let you out, let you out, let you out, let you out. Kind of thing that I think would be quite easy for all of you to say. Let you out doesn't cause surprises. It's actually in the middle of a little battle going on in English at the moment. We've got 2 competing processes. One is this assimilation, this coalescence, palatalization as it's sometimes called. But the other one is the trend to pronounce T at the glottis. If instead of let, you say let, then instead of let you out, you get let you out. Will they let you out? And I don't know which of these 2 is going to win. I don't know in 50 years, 100 years' time, whether people will be saying let you out or let you out. I somewhat suspect it'll be the glottal one, let you out. I think that's sort of becoming more and more prevalent, but it's too early to say. All we need to note at the moment is that you can pronounce it in either way. That's just for the T. D doesn't become glottal, so would you try becomes would you try, would you, would you. Now again, what I'm telling you in today's lecture is a kind of set of permissions which go against some of the things you've been taught in class. For example, Spaniards, we have been drilling you to say you and not you. I do not want you to say you know instead of you know. But if it's do you know, where do has its weak form do, loses its vowel very often. And then we get do you know, that can become do you know. But it's not you know, it's do you know. Did you enjoy yourself? Did you, that's all right, did you enjoy yourself? Did you enjoy yourself? Would you do it tomorrow? Would you do it tomorrow? That's fine. Had you thought about this? Had you thought about it? With the word you, then the pronoun, and also your, the possessive pronoun, widely believed by foreign students to be pronounced your, but actually usually pronounced your. So get your bags, get your bags. Did your father come yesterday? Did your, and so on. Okay, let me finish on assimilation by repeating the point that you must not only be aware in some sense of the English assimilations, but you must guard against doing the assimilations that your own language does. Some languages have very complicated assimilation rules. I think of Korean as an example where they are really extremely intricate. Koreans, I think, with a phrase like this man might come up with them man. I don't know, but anyhow, many languages have voicing assimilation, which doesn't operate in English. Many languages do other kinds of assimilation that differ. What I have listed here is the principal kinds of assimilation that do operate in English. Let's turn over the page now and move on to, first of all, to elision. Elision is the omission of a sound that would otherwise be present. I think we'll skip over the paragraph number 2 on the handout and move on to the paragraph number 3. This is the most frequent kind of elision of consonants in English. It applies when we have words ending in consonant clusters, and the last one of them is a T or a D. For example, first. If I say the first thing I want to talk about, the first thing I want to talk about, here we've got a T in a typical position where it gets elided, omitted. Because in running speech, we don't normally say first thing, the first thing, the first thing. We can do that, but it's very careful. What we normally do is get rid of the T and say the first thing I want to say, first thing, the first thing, the first thing. Again, what I'm giving you is a set of permissions. Japanese students, Spanish students for that matter, various others, have problems with final clusters like ST. We make you practice saying first, quite correctly, because English speakers do say first in front of a vowel or in front of nothing at the end of a sentence. But when the next sound is a consonant in the next word, then you can omit the T. And it would be, in my view, much better to say the first thing than to say the first thing, making a great effort over putting the T in. Not first thing, but first thing, the first thing. After I've told you that, the next thing I want to mention, the next thing, we don't usually say the next thing. The next thing, we lose that T as well. If we've got a word like past, the next word is, say, months. I've been studying this over the past months. Quite difficult to get all those consonants in. Well, we can at any rate get rid of that one in the past months. Again, if I dictate to you, I've been studying it over the past months, I want you to spell it correctly as P-A-S-T. I don't want you to say you're saying past, therefore I'm going to spell P-A-S-S. No, of course, in this environment, they sound identical, but you must make the appropriate judgment. Native speakers sometimes get this wrong, I must admit. When agents for something take bookings before the time for which they're required, these are known as advanced bookings. We all know how to pronounce it, advanced bookings. But many people are not sure whether or not to write a D in here, because this is a T, you see, advanced bookings, in precisely this environment where we get the possibility of elision. So it's going to be pronounced the same whether or not there's the D ending there, advanced bookings. In fact, its standard spelling is without the D. On the menu in the refectory a few weeks ago, there was mention of corned beef. Corned beef, standard spelling of course is corned beef. But that D is in the environment where it can be lost. If you look on the handout, 3b, you'll see a list of the clusters from which T or D is most frequently elided. So 3.1 on the handout, it says T may be elided in FT, ST, and less commonly in those other ones. So let's take some examples. On the left side of the room, what can happen there? We lose the T we get on the left side of the room, on the left side. ST, we've had an example in past months. D may be elided in LD, ND, and less commonly in some of the others. Well, we had an example of ND in corn B, D. LD would come in a phrase like, oh, man. Where the D can go, giving us, oh, man. What is the small bag that a lady carries with her? Is it called a handbag? Well, it is in Oscar Wilde's drama with Lady Bracknell, who articulates extremely clearly as handbag, but it's not in ordinary everyday speech. Think about handbag. Here we have ND at the end of the first syllable, consonant of B at the beginning of the next. So that D is likely to drop, a handbag. We've now got an N before a B. And this takes us back to the first thing we started with, assimilation. This is like 10 boys. So the result of that is we can often get an M, and the result is handbag, as if it were a bag for ham, which of course it isn't. So, I don't know, perhaps it's worth emphasizing the problem that might arise sometimes of understanding native speakers correctly. I'm sure you wouldn't be so silly as to think of a handbag as being for ham, but in other less familiar cases you might be caused momentary misunderstanding through these natural processes that native speakers do perform. Right, at the bottom of the box about elision, you will see then the examples next thing, which we've had. Stand, thus clear, stand clear. There you could get a further assimilation. Stand clear. Elision of the D, stand clear. Now there's an N or a vela, so it could change to N, stand clear. The last point on the handout concerns words ending in the contracted negative, when not contracts to nt, because some speakers readily elide the T from that, and instead of didn't, they'll therefore pronounce didn't without a T. I didn't think you were going to do it. I didn't think you were going to do it. Instead of I didn't think. I can't believe it. What's happening there? Well, can't believe it. T wouldn't normally go from NT, but it does in the contracted negative form. So they can lose that N. Having lost that, they can assimilate, and you can get I can't believe it. You can also get assimilation without elision, thus I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Again, we do have to remember not to elide things that English doesn't elide. If we take, for example, think, followed by a consonant, let's say, the, I think they are right. I think they're right. Some people I hear saying things like, I think they're right. Not possible in English. You cannot elide K in that environment. You can't elide K in any environment, really, except for just one or two words like the past tense of us. So don't forget the K in a phrase like, I think they're right. It's got to be present. You hear the moment of silence, think, that tells you it's okay. speakers of some languages tend to neglect very many syllable final consonants. Well, we've seen that there are some that you can neglect in English, but you mustn't neglect the other ones. What I haven't got on the handout here, which I did refer to briefly at the beginning, is the possible loss of dental fricatives in some environments. Which I think I referred to in the first lecture of all. In a phrase like, is that true? What can we do about this cluster? Is that true? Well, in rapid speech, in fact, the can either disappear or be assimilated to the Z. So you get either a Z or nothing on the pronunciation. Is that true? Is that true? Is that what you want? Is that what you think? Or is that? Notice the direction of the assimilation or the choice of the elision. It's the TH sound, the dental, that gets affected. It is not the Z. You can't say, is that true? You can't use the Z. This, I think, is very typically found with the high-frequency words beginning with the, that is the article, the, and that, and this, and those, and so on. Of course, it's only those rather high-frequency words that do begin with the, so we can see why we should expect that. It's difficult to circumscribe. In Cockney and so on, you get very much wider loss of the. And in popular London English, you can just neglect the at the beginning of words like this or that. You hear Londoners talking about isn't. That is this and that. But I don't wish to encourage you to do such a vulgar thing. It might help to understand people if you know about it. Let's move on now to the last phenomenon we're looking at in this first lecture, which is the matter of R-Liaison. Phenomenon traditionally known as linking R, but I want to cover not only linking R, but what's traditionally known as intrusive R, and to treat them as one single phenomenon. In accents like RP, non-rhotic accents, we've undergone a historical process that meant we lost R whenever it wasn't followed by a vowel. We've retained the possibility of R before a vowel, like read and very and arrive, but when R historically was followed by a consonant, or when it was followed by nothing, we lost it. So where people once upon a time said a beard or a farm, we lost that and we say beard, farm. And where people once upon a time said for, and near, we now say for and near. Of course, there are many other accents of English that haven't undergone this change, in particular German American and Scottish and Irish English. Anyhow, really what we're talking about is the residue of this historical process. Because if we've got, for example, what was historically 4, the number 1, 2, 3, 4, as we've seen, we lost that R when the following sound was a consonant. For people, or if it's at the end of the sentence, I've got 4. But when this was followed by a vowel sound, like, for example, 4 apples, 4 eggs, you can see that the historical environment for the loss of the R was not satisfied, so we retained it. Only nowadays, this means that what we have is an alternation whereby we get 4 in front of a vowel and 4 before a consonant. And that's what we now have come to regard as an automatic alternation for any words ending in or in the other vowels listed at 2 on the handout in R-Liaison, where this alternation applies. So look at the examples we've got here. The first example is far, distant. As it says, in isolation, before a consonant sound, this word is in RP pronounced far. But in a phrase such as far away, far out, usually pronounced far because of the of away, the of out. Far away, far out. Now, usually, not always, not necessarily. People do sometimes say far away. People do sometimes say far out, far out. But usually, we say far away, far out. And with the opposite word near, in isolation, it's pronounced near, up. But in a phrase like near enough, then you get the R, near enough. Again, you can say near enough, but usually we say near enough. So this is the phenomenon of linking R, which I'm sure you're familiar with and I expect you've practiced. Complication really arises because people don't know how to spell. Or putting that another way, native speakers of English don't think first of all of the spelling, they think of the pronunciation. And this means that we treat various other words in exactly the same way, although they have a different historical origin. I've given you the example, comma, in 4 on the handout. In isolation, it's pronounced comma, punctuation mark. This is a comma. I'm placing a comma before your eyes. But if the following word begins with a vowel, like you ought to put a comma in here, then that's what we usually say. You ought to put a comma in here. We add an R to that one as well. Preserving the general alternation between R in front of a vowel and 0 before a consonant. The second example given on the handout, the verb thaw, to thaw. When the next word begins with a vowel, to thaw out, then we can pronounce it thaw with the R, thaw out. Just like bore, to bore out, to store up. Same alternation. And I say it's really because we learn to speak before we learn to read and write. And although foreign learners of English may learn a word in its written form, basically, and then in some sense undergo a process of saying aloud the letters that they have learnt, that's not how native speakers operate. We learn the word before we learn to read and write. We know how to say it. We then come along and our question as native speakers is always, how do you spell so-and-so? We're not sure about the spelling. We're quite sure about the pronunciation. And of course, when we're speaking at speed, we don't have time to stop and think of the spelling and therefore to know what to do. It's a very natural process. You can see how it would operate with a pair of words like rota. These words are pronounced identically. Rota. The first rota is part of a helicopter. The second rota is a list of duties. Who's got to do what when? They're homophones, pronounced identically. Both of them are rota. Many people might hesitate about the spelling, and they might put up a list of duties, spelling it with OR at the end, because they think it's like the helicopter. Or somebody else might spell the part of the helicopter with an A at the end. But we, all of us, will tend to say the rota isn't ready, whichever of these two words is involved, because they're pronounced identically, so they both undergo the same process. That's why I say that this intrusive R is really the same thing as linking R, even though that may seem strange to those whose eyes are fixed on the spelling, or those who grow up speaking a different kind of English, Scottish English, Irish English, American English, where this whole business doesn't operate. I think it's, from the point of view of foreign learners, something that is important mainly perhaps from the point of view of understanding, not to be misled. Because I have often told people the story, which is a genuinely true one, when I was present in an Italian restaurant and someone asked for a vanilla rice. Vanilla rice. But schwa, before a vowel, you get this vanilla rice. Where's my vanilla rice? Along comes the waiter with some rice. We have, I want a vanilla rice. We have no vanilla rice, plain rice. And there was really quite a long misunderstanding. Because the Englishman, of course, couldn't see the point. He hadn't asked for rice, he'd asked for ice. And the Italian waiter didn't understand what he was on about. So it is important, receptively, to know about the possibility of intrusive R. Opinion is divided whether we ought to encourage foreign learners to actually use it productively. If we take the line that our job is to teach you to speak as similarly to native speakers as we can manage, and your job is to model yourself on native speakers, then I think we ought to encourage you to do intrusive R, because native speakers do it, unless they make a special effort not to. If, on the other hand, you take the line that it's a complication that's unnecessary for comprehension, well, that's quite true, and nobody's going to have any problem in understanding you if you neglect intrusive R, but you might have problems understanding the English, and that's why it's worth mentioning. Okay, thank you then for this.